Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another freaking-tastic episode of RfRx. My name is Eric Wells, and I am the online programming director for Recovering from Religion. And with me as my co-host is Trent Emery, my good friend, a Recovering from Religion helpline agent. How you doing, sir?
I'm great, sir. Thank you for having me again.
Well, thank you for being had. At the beginning of every RfRx, my friends, we have a poll, and today is no different. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. Feel free to answer as you see fit. We're not going to really know who answers how. We have 3 questions today. And the very first question is, how far back in human history does religion go? 2,000 years, 5,000 years, 10,000 years, or 100,000 years? Question number 2. Where do you think the ancestral Jewish people came from? Egypt, Chaldea, Canaan, or the United States of America? Question number 3. Why do the Gospels portray Jesus as always arguing with the Pharisees? Because Jesus disagrees with the fundamental principles of the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees were good people. Because the Sadducees were all killed off before the books were written. Or because the Pharisees were hypocrites. So this poll will be running while we are kind of doing our introduction, and we'll wrap it up as we introduce our guest. We're here tonight at a show produced by Recovering from Religion called RfRx, and this is where we get to bring on guests to talk about topics that really the people come to RfR for. They're struggling, like the fear of hell, or suddenly realizing they're a secular parent, and they come to Recovering from Religion for help. And so we have started this series. We're over 100 episodes in now, 2 years in, and we are providing these amazing discussions, bringing on experts that talk us through the things that we're experiencing. Oh, it has been a fantastic journey over these last 2 years. This is not at all a replacement for the online community, for the helpline, or even for the support groups. Instead, this is more complementary to that. A lot of the things that we talk about here, they show up as questions on the helpline or discussions on the helpline. They show up as discussions in the support groups or in the online community as well. And so really, these experts, these amazing people that come on, they provide great advice and good coping skills that we can use if we're struggling with these same concerns or these same issues or doubts. If you have any questions or topics or comments or inquiries, you can send us an email at rfrx@recoveringfromreligion.org. And if you miss a part of this, or if you want to kind of see what else we have in our video library, we've got a YouTube channel, youtube.com/ you guess it, Recovering from Religion. Trent, what's RfR?
Yes, sir. RfR is, well, it's just a lovely
I know
organization. But we have a mission statement, and it is to offer hope, healing, and support to those struggling with issues of doubt and non-belief. So how are we doing that? And how to reach out to us? Well, for healing, we have a helpline, and that is where you can call, you can text in, and people are listening in with an empathetic ear. There is no judgment, no criticism. No one's going to try to convince you of one thing or another. We're here to just help you with the struggle that you're having. Imagine it like a good friend who actually cares about you. And we offer 24/7 support via those channels, which are the online chat and the phone line. And we have resources on our webpage at recoveringfromreligion.org, and that's going to be in the chat. And we can help in another way, Eric, and that is with hope, which I will toss over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, hope. That's another part of our mission, hope. And for me, the hope is kind of the sharing and listening to some personal stories where it was a dark time for someone, and they struggled through something, and they got through it and kind of shared the exhilaration of that moment. I remember distinctly when I no longer could believe in my old spiritual mindset, and looking forward in the future, it was completely unknown. It was completely dark, and that was scary. These stories that are shared with us on our blog and on the old podcast episodes, those are really what is kind of, for me, helped sort of give me a brief glimpse of how life could be beyond a spiritual mindset, beyond religion, beyond Christianity. So if that sounds interesting to you, if you like reading blogs, if you like listening to podcasts, drop a link into the chat and follow us. Give us a follow over there too. Support, that's another part of our mission. We have support groups, ladies and gentlemen. Folks, there are support groups all over the world, well over 60 of them to date. And these are where we get to meet face to face, whether it's in person. We're starting to get more and more in-person meetings, or over Zoom. Most of them are still over Zoom, over virtual support group meetings. And I got to tell you, listening to the stories, kind of in the hope part, like the blog and the podcast, listening to stories really kind of gave me a clearer insight about like what I was going through. And then when I was struggling with stuff, I was able to bring it to the support group program and talk about what I was going through and listen to also to other folks who were going through something similar as well. We have, like I said, we've got over 60 around the world, and you can take a look at the website and find the one nearest you. We also have 2 virtual meetings and virtual chapters as well. And you can find those on Eventbrite. All right, Trent, what's next?
Yes, and next we partner with, or are certainly suggest that you connect if you're having struggles for therapy and therapeutic purposes instead of reaching out to the helpline or the chat line. We have the Secular Therapy Project, and this connects you with a licensed secular mental health care provider. I've dealt with this personally. My first therapist tried to tell me that, there were ghosts and I was going to see my dead ones in the afterlife. Well, you don't have to worry about that with the Secular Therapy Project. They're carefully screened for the following criteria: appropriate licensing for their state and or their country. They maintain a secular practice, no proselytizing. There's no mention of religion. This is here to help you exclusively. And they use only evidence-based treatments. So you're going to get the best care. You know that it's honest, and you can rely on the fact that they're not going to make whatever situation that you have in your life or struggles that you have, particularly regarding religion, worse for you. In my opinion, this should be every therapist that exists. You got to use the best evidence-based treatments. Anyways, that is seculartherapy.org. If you're interested, I highly recommend them. They're a wonderful organization. Check them out. That should be in the chat. And then Eric, online community.
Yes. The online community, folks. This is a fantastic place. Like, one of the things that we were missing with the Recovering from Religion sort of ecosystem was a community of sorts. The online community, the Recovering from Religion online community, is a private place that you can't find on the internet. You can't search for on the internet. You have to go through the helpline. But this is where we're able to kind of connect and talk with people who have gone through similar situations as us. Say, for example, you're an ex-Jehovah's Witness. I am not an ex-Jehovah's Witness, but and so there are many things that I haven't really been able to understand or experience that you went through. So in the online community for Recovering from Religion, there is a whole channel we use Slack. There's a whole channel for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. There's a channel for secular parenting. There's a channel for military folks, both current and former. And so if that's something that you're looking for, kind of looking for some help, looking for some people that can relate to what you're going through, then connect with our helpline and head on over there and see if they'll ask you a few questions, see if you could fit, and send you an invite to our online community. Now, if you are looking for a fantastic community of non-believers, I would strongly recommend checking out the atheist community of Discord. These folks are currently streaming this program into their Discord channel, and I can't thank them enough for that. This has been such a great idea that they had like a year and a half ago, and super consistent ever since then. And the people in there, I love getting to see what they write and the conversations that they have. So if you're looking for community, head on over to the Atheist Community Discord. In addition to that, volunteering. Everyone you're seeing here who is kind of running this and talking tonight, we are all volunteers. We're doing this to kind of further the mission of providing hope, healing, and support for folks who are struggling with doubt and non-belief. I've been volunteering for, 6 or 7 years now. Started out as support group leader, and I got to tell you, it has been such an incredible ride. I am a better person because of the work that I've done with Recovering from Religion, that they've allowed me to help out with, and I can't recommend it enough. So if you've got some time, you've got the passion, you've got the interest, check out volunteering with Recovering from Religion. Okay, folks, that is enough of the whole intro. Let me tell you what to expect for this evening. The first hour or so, it's not really a hard stop that we're going to do. First hour or so, we're going to have a discussion with our guest, and I am so excited to have him on again. This is the second time he's been on. And then during that discussion, you're probably going to have some questions. And so please, please, please don't hesitate to type those questions into the chat. Trent and I will be collecting those questions. And during the second part of the conversation, the discussion, we're going to have a Q&A session with our guest. And then after that, we're going to wrap up the show with some closing thoughts by our founder and president, Dr. Darrel Ray. And then we're going to hang out. Our guest may or may not have some time to stick around, but we'll find out about that later. But this hangout part is a fun time where I shut the recording off, I open up the lines, and we're able to kind of just have a conversation, talk about what came up for you during the conversation, during the discussion, what's been going on for you. It's a fantastic time. All right. So without further ado, my good friend Trent, would you mind introducing our fantastic guest?
I would be happy to, and I'm very excited, as I think this is one of the most fascinating subjects. Whether you're religious or not, it's incredible. So Dr. Mark Reimers is a computational neuroscientist at Michigan State University, where he researches how animal brains work and how human genes affect brain function. His broader aim is to ground our understanding of feeling and thought in the facts of biology. Dr. Reimers was raised Christian, but found a path to humanism, in his 20s. Since then, he has been a humanist leader and speaker for over a decade in Virginia and now in Michigan. So thank you for again, your time here.
Well, thank you, Eric and Trent. Glad to be here again. And I agree, this is one of the most sort of fascinating conversations, because it's one of the most mysterious and puzzling subjects, both, when I was religious and now that I'm very much post-religious. What is it all about? Why? How did it get here? And Eric has asked me to do a series of talks, sort of looking at the question, what is it all about? And last time I spoke to you about the biology of religion. And next time I'm hoping to speak to you about some of the social psychology of religion. But today I want to talk about the evolution of religion. And I pick those words pretty carefully because, I'm thinking of not just a history, but a kind of evolutionary story where you're looking at, some inheritance, some mutation or modification, and then a stringent selective pressure. So no metaphor is completely adequate to every task, but I think an evolutionary metaphor gets us started in thinking about and asking some good questions about the history of religion, which is otherwise just a real dog's breakfast of different gods, different idols, different practices, weird music, and all kinds of other things. So we're going to try to make sense of that story and see it as a kind of organic evolution, like the evolution of mammals or some other story. So let me get started.
I have never heard of the phrase dog's breakfast, but it totally makes sense. This topic has been so interesting for me. One of the things that really kicked it off for me, like way back in the day, was I read a book by Karen Armstrong, The History of God. It just blew my mind. It really, really was an amazing book for me. And
I think she's a great writer. I mean, I disagree with a lot of, she's very sort of spiritual, but I think she's really done a nice job. And that some of my introduction to some of these topics was also through other books by Karen Armstrong. So let me get this to view. Okay, are we ready to go? Everyone see that?
We're ready. I see it. You're looking good.
Okay, so as I said, this is a complex subject. We're going to kind of do the 1 week tour of Europe version. So if it's Tuesday, it must be Belgium. And we're not really going to spend a lot of time on any one topic, but there's much more to be said. So what I'm trying to do is sort of give you an overview of how at least religion as we know it today got started, and from an evolutionary perspective. And as I said, we're looking for inheritance, what gets passed on. And I think we'll see that it's gods and rituals, to some extent stories, that get passed on. Beliefs are much more malleable, which is kind of the opposite to the way we think. How beliefs change within the religion, and finally selective pressures. What is it that makes a religion succeed in the Roman Empire but not today, or that might have made a religion succeed in Africa but not here, or vice versa? These are the kinds of questions that are going to be in mind. So just an outline, as Eric told you, I'm going to do this in 3 parts. I'm going to start with sort of early religion, as far back as, at least that I can read, we've been able to determine, and then go into the origins of the biblical God, and then from there to Christianity and up to modern religion, which is most of where our experience is. And then we'll have a more open discussion. During the Q&A breaks, I'm not sure if it's Eric or Trent or someone else is going to be reading questions from the chat. So please do put your questions, formulate your questions and put them in the chat, and they'll select some to try to get going. So let's start with the beginnings of religion. And, what's our earliest evidence of at least human religious feeling? Of course, nobody wrote psalms or, drew pictures of gods, at least that we can identify, 100,000 years ago. But there's certainly evidence of graves dug with some care. So this is a representation, schematic, of course, of what the archaeologists imagine might have been a scene in a cave. I believe this is Shanidar Cave in what's now Iraq. How long ago do you suppose this scene would have happened? So that it's based on, an excavation that was done in the 1950s in Shanidar Cave, where they actually dug up the body of this we think teenage boy who had apparently lots of flowers laid on his grave, and was deliberately laid to the put on his side and laid down in a fetal position. All very symbolic. So whoever did this had quite a some sort of imagination. How long ago do you imagine this was?
Just from the picture, it looks like cavemen, so maybe 50, 75,000 years ago.
Sure. So that sounds very reasonable. In fact, the Shanidar Cave is dated to 150,000 years ago.
Twice as long ago as I had thought. Wow.
And not only that, this is not Homo sapiens. This is Homo neanderthalis. So,
this is like a cousin of ours.
Right. So, we're looking at something that is very old in our species, insofar as, again, is this careful burial? It's, more than utilitarian. Does that qualify as religious? It's some extent a matter of definition, but it's sort of shading into the kinds of things that, become part of religion. And then 100,000 years later, we start seeing these Venus statuettes appear in Europe. And, it seems to most archaeologists that these are fertility symbols. Of course, what can we say? They don't come with an instruction manual. So we don't know what their real purpose was. But it's certainly, some of the first art in Europe. So what can we infer about the people who made these things, or who performed these burials? Best we can do is look to contemporary societies that live as close as we can find to the way our ancestors lived. So these are people we might call hunter-gatherers. Some of the people of the Kalahari, most of them have been bulldozed by now, but there are still some people living in the savannas of Tanzania, the Hadza people, and there are still a few groups deeper in the jungles that anthropologists can look at and say, well, this is our best approximation to how human ancestors lived 100,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago, or in most places, past 10,000 years ago. So what could qualify as religion among them? And again, there's some really excellent books been written by the people who were first in the Kalahari, talking to the indigenous folks there. And but there's certainly only fragments of what we would call religion. So there's certainly group singing and dancing, except it's a lot more fun than singing hymns in church. They seem to have a really good time. And then there's something we might call a healing ritual. And of course, this is working people up in a trance state. And, they say, of course, that it works. What we would call this miraculous, if it were true. It seems to be like, so-called faith healings everywhere, that they, are particularly effective for things like multiple sclerosis, which is highly variable from day to day and very susceptible to nervous system activation. And certainly with all the social pressure on you, you can imagine how motivated some people will be. But what's really interesting is that they really have no beliefs that we would regard as theology. They have stories about, the creation of the world, but basically whoever created the world just sort of buggered off and isn't really involved with either the day-to-day running of the world or with our behavior, with our morality. So the traditional peoples have very elaborate codes of morality, of conduct, but they're not handed down from God. There's no gods or warrant for those. They're custom and tradition. So there's also very little superstition. They don't, feel there's this unlucky things to do or things that will anger the spirits. If they believe, religious beliefs are quite variable. There's no orthodoxy or doctrine, but they, if those who do think about spirits at all think of them in a seem to think of them in a fairly diffuse way, according to the sources that I've read, and that they don't have much superstition. It's not like you don't walk under a ladder or let a black cat cross your path. So we might ask, well, where did spirits come from? And I don't think, again, there's really a consensus from what I can read about this, but I think a fairly common story runs something like two major sources, or maybe three major sources. There's sort of nature, and sometimes that's special places. Sometimes you remember, if you just go into the forest, sometimes you come across a glade lit by the sunlight, and it just seems very special. It's sort of numinous in that, and it evokes very ethereal feelings. So we think that it's a source of an association with the place, not with us. Impressive natural phenomena like storms and volcanoes. Nearly every society that experiences storms or volcanoes deifies them. And of course, ancestors. And this is something that really marks a difference in the economy, which we'll come to. And we see the first, what we might, if we were Christians, call idols, but figurines representing these ancestors. So what's changed? What has happened to make this sort of change in religious feeling? Because the hunter-gatherers don't care much about their ancestors. They know who their parents were, but they don't, keep track of what their ancestors might be thinking or feeling. They're gone. But we really start seeing a concern with ancestors or and other spirits, and spirits that are powerful enough that you might call them sort of minor gods among the subsistence farmers. So in Botswana until fairly recently, the hunter-gatherers were living side by side with the Herero farmers. And the anthropologists always were amazed at how these supposedly more modern Herero farmers were very, very superstitious. And there were so many things they couldn't do because it would anger the spirits. Whereas the hunter-gatherers were very down to earth, pragmatic. And I think you have to keep in mind that, of course, their lifestyle is very different. That for farmers, you're going to invest a fair bit of work, but you're hoping for a big payoff, a massive harvest at some point. But you're also subject to the weather. If it's a drought or a massive torrential rain, all of your work could be washed away or dried up. So there's much more anxiety among subsistence farmers, and we think that that's part of why they took spirits and ancestors much, much more seriously. But there's still nothing at this point that, no temples, no churches, there's no evidence of organized religion until something like 10,000 years ago, a little older than that, before 10,000 years ago. And this is a remarkable find. It was only discovered, I think, about 30 years ago. Seems to date to 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. And there are these enormous stone circles, some of them up to, enormous pillars in these stone circles. Some of them are up to 20 tons. And some of these stones have come from a long way away. And you just think, just a second, this is nuts. Who's building this? Well, probably it is nuts in a way. But it was something that was, very important for the people who participated. Again, no records, we don't have any space capsules or any recordings, saying, what these people were thinking, time capsules, I meant to say. But one remarkable, coincidence is that this seems to be where wheat was domesticated. And the varieties of wheat that were developed here seem to have spread throughout the world, through the Near East and then through the rest of the world. So we have evidence of some sort of organized religion. We have absolutely no idea what they believed or thought. On the left-hand side, sorry, I should have said this earlier, the left-hand side is what the ruins look like today. And the right-hand side is what archaeologists' best guess as to what it looked like when it was functional, in say 9,000 BCE. Okay, so what is the role of religion in the early Mid-Eastern states? Okay, so we're talking about places like Sumeria and then Acadia, Babylon, and that whole area, which we call the Fertile Crescent, or at least part of what is called the Fertile Crescent, depends on maintaining canals. So there's the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They're coming down and providing lots of water, but most of the land is very, very dry. You can't grow anything on it unless you irrigate it. It's very, very fertile because those rivers have been flooding for millions of years and depositing rich, fertile soil on either side. So they'd be great for growing crops, except that there's essentially no rain, but there is a lot of water coming down the river. So if you can build and maintain canals, those of you who've ever tried to maintain, waterways out of dirt have some idea of what I'm speaking of. You have to maintain them constantly. This is a full-time job. So somebody has to dig the ditches, so to speak, and somebody has to grow the food. And they have to work out what it's, how they're going to exchange food for the fact that water is coming. And it seems that the temples, the earliest Sumerian temples, were the sort of guarantors of the social contract, that those who would dig canals would also get a good share of the farmers' crops. And later on, they seem to have evolved into a kind of general, redistribution center, and kind of, you might think of it as poorhouse or workhouse. I don't think that, the sort of Dickensian phrases are not particularly appropriate, because it seems like they actually took pretty good care of people who were sort of not part of an extended family and did not have a homestead. One of the most puzzling for a long time, but one of the most ubiquitous artifacts that people found in these temples are these 1 kilo ration buckets. It's just there by the tens of thousands littering the grounds. And that seems to have been how they, passed out the rations for the workers. So here's, yeah, I don't think those pictures need to explain. So, okay, so we have what seems like a relatively benign way of, using belief in the gods to solve a kind of social problem. And in fact, the early Sumerian myths were sort of structured around this fundamental contract between the ditch diggers and the farmers, because the creation story in Sumeria ran that the gods were tired of digging canals, so they created human beings in order to do that dirty labor. And then they therefore, this, according to the story, that was how they got to have the right of adjudicating how much the canal workers would get paid in grain and in beer and other things, but that's another story. All right, so how do we get the kind of very hierarchical and unequal religion that we have today? And it's, there's two major stops on this journey and a lot of minor stops, but one of them really goes back to Sargon the Great, who actually was a pretty competent guy who came from nowhere. Very interesting character, but very ruthless too, kind of like a Genghis Khan of 2300 BC. And he saw that the priesthood and the palace were sort of at that time, competing centers of authority. And so he had the idea that he could nominate or after his conquests, replace the priests of the gods in many different temples with his own family or his friends. And that they then would be subsumed, they would then speak with one voice to validate his rule. And of course, he got a great deal done. Not all of it very nice. And then you start seeing a pattern where, after one state conquers another state, they sort of fuse their pantheons, and the patron god of the city-state that's the winner, gets to be the king of the gods in the subsequent mythology over the whole conquered area. So this top right picture is Sargon, and the bottom is Marduk, who was, an ordinary, god of a small city-state. It just happened to be that small city-state was Babylon, which expanded to become a major power. This is the first Babylonian Empire. So, okay, so there's all of these gods around here. It's not usually the case prior to, at least as far as I can tell, prior to maybe 2000 BC, that you have a sort of king of the gods on a regular basis, sort of a rotating story. But as I mentioned with Marduk and Babylon, there's enough Egyptian dynasties that now we can sort of trace how the religion turns over, or the pantheon reorders itself every time there's a new dynasty. There's something like 25 Egyptian dynasties, and most of them, the same gods stick around, except they sort of get reordered, and some of them become prime gods and some become relatively less important gods. And the same thing happened with the Assyrian Empire around 800 BC. And that seems to reflect, again, this is sort of historical speculation, but it's plausible that, as you go from 25 the Sumerian cities to Assyria, you're looking at greater and greater concentration of power. The king is not only just the heavy around here, he's also running the show more actively and organizing things. So this idea of a king of the gods, or where there's maybe a leading god who you pay most attention to, as opposed to, everybody worshiping the god of their village or town. Is the technical term for that is called henotheism, so one leading god. But that's not the same as monotheism. So I want to emphasize that in the Bronze Age, and really until maybe 500 BC, monotheism was extremely rare. The only real record we have in the Middle East is this brief reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten, who had a distinctive artistic style, very interesting character, but he proclaimed a kind of monotheism. So instead of saying, well, Aten is the best god, and the chief god, he's saying, no, Aten is the only god. All of the others are fakes. And this put a lot of the priests out of business, and he was not, let's say, very popular with the religious administration of his time. And after he died, they made sure to file off his name from every monument. So he wasn't even known to history until his capital at Amarna had been dug up accidentally. So I think we can say that in some sense, monotheism is very unnatural. It doesn't arise spontaneously, and it's only in special circumstances. But of course, today it's very common. So let me, in the interests of time, maybe skip over that and just say, the end of the Bronze Age is when things really start to change, when we get a lot of the new kind of religion. So iron tools seem to make farmers, they changed the way, how much productivity there was in the land, and they also made it possible for merchants to become wealthy. So they really, we have merchants from the Bronze Age, and they became somewhat wealthy, but iron tools and weights and measures and fittings for boats really made it possible for commerce to expand over wide distances. So it became a very big change, and sort of overturned the traditional order. So lots of things happened. So the bottom right picture is a scene from a painting, an 18th century painting about the collapse of the Bronze Age cities. So let me pause there and take some questions. And either Eric or Trent, do you want to, and I'll just.
Yeah, I got the screen share and stop for a minute. Yeah, we got a question, kind of working a little bit backwards. The god Aten, or Aten, I think, did they think he was the actual sun? Was
Yes,
the god itself?
Oh yeah, he was. Sun is, if you've been to Egypt, you will understand the sun is pretty powerful. It shapes your life.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. And then we had another question. You had mentioned there was a story of where the gods got tired of maintaining the canals, and so they invented the humans or created the humans. Where did that story come from?
That is the Sumerian creation myth.
Oh, okay.
Do I remember the title of the poem? I do not, sorry. But
Got
that's
it.
Yeah. So, but if we teach evolution, we should probably teach the Sumerian creation myth too, don't you think?
for equal time, yeah.
We've got a couple of others here, Eric. I mean, some of them are kind of more generalized, but I don't know if we want to ask those now or later on.
I'll take a couple more now.
Yeah.
Another 3 minutes. Yeah.
Someone had asked very early on when we were talking about the burial practices, if you were familiar with Homo naledi, I think, which was actually recently discovered. They said approximately 200,000 years ago was the time frame wherein they allegedly, anyways, intentionally laid bodies deep within caves.
I have read about that, and that's certainly very arresting. My understanding from the reports I've read about Homo naledi suggests that it's still disputed whether there was remember 100,000 years ago, or I forget, it's 150,000 years ago when those creatures were alive, they could have been washed. The rivers were quite different, and there's still people who think that they were washed in that this was just a place where a lot of bodies washed up after they were drowned, that long ago. And there's other people who think these were deliberately tossed into a mass grave.
Right.
So it's not kind of the personal attention. You might almost think of it as like a sanitation or hygiene.
Right.
It doesn't seem they were treated with a lot of respect. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, that was my intuition too, is that it may be, it's an incidental factor of, what they had realized would be hygienic, the more hygienic burial practices as opposed to spiritual or religious burial practices.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, one more short one and then.
Yeah, I think we got one more here, Eric.
Yeah, how heavily with your we may not have a whole lot of evidence for this, but how heavily do you think that the early religions were driven by grief and the desire to see loved ones in the afterlife versus kind of a way to enforce group conformity or societal norms?
Can I answer that in 2 slides from now?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go back to things here. And okay, so let me talk about the rise of biblical religion. And one of the peculiarities I think that many Christians find is that there's no afterlife in the Old Testament. There's no heaven, there's no hell. And Christians get very flustered when they have to find a reference to heaven or hell in the Old Testament. You have to really twist very, very hard. And so who invented heaven and hell, and why aren't they in the Old Testament? So much of the Old Testament is reflecting Middle Eastern ideas at the time, in which if there was any afterlife of any sort, it was rather grim and gray and dull. The Hebrew term sheol, just, there isn't any place. And if you look at the ancient Greek myths, Hades is not hell. Hades is a very dim, dull place where people are bored out of their minds and they're very sad. So this doesn't make it sound like, going to heaven was very much on the agenda of ancient religion. And that is by and large true. With a few exceptions, it's not a common motif. One of the exceptions is some periods of Egyptian religion. But the person who really put heaven and hell on the map was a fellow named Zarathustra. And as far as we can tell, and remember, this is all very difficult to date, and we only have copies of things that Zarathustra may or may not have authored. But he's a traditional priest of the Avestan religion, which is something like a typical Bronze Age religion. But his society is being torn apart. Some people are engaging in basically what we would call cattle rustling, and most people are sort of like the Wild West. And he was trying to come up with a modification of the Avestan religion that could, provide some sort of morale boost to the people, in his village or his city. We're not entirely sure where he lived. And so he changed, and this is a very, very brief summary, but he basically took the old Avestan stories and reworked them so that Ahura Mazda, who was a good god in the traditional Western religion, became the master god. And Ahriman, who's a sort of minor evil character in the Western religion, becomes the anti-god, becomes something like what we would call the devil. And he portrays the whole world as a battleground between good and evil, but the battle is fundamentally ethical and metaphorical rather than physical. So he is the one who sort of coined the idea of, the idea of a righteous war against evil, by which so many Christians and other religious people really embrace. But he introduced the idea of paradise, which is a good Persian word meaning an enclosed garden, which is what we've made into heaven. He introduced the eternal fire, and this picture just down below is a medieval representation of the from a Zoroastrian artist of what heaven and hell might have looked like for them. Of course, nobody had any pictures or paintings of Zoroaster. This is, sort of modern sentimental account. But he also introduced, the notion of a final judgment, that instead of good and evil being rewarded here and now, which is, what essentially all of the Bronze Age religions told you, very much like the prosperity gospel today, that if you're good, the gods will reward you in this life. But he said instead of that, we're gonna, you're gonna have a hard time in this life, and you have to be a soldier for the forces of good. If any of you have ever sung "Onward, Christian Soldiers," which was already unfashionable, I think, when I was a kid. But that's the kind of military motif or military metaphor that a lot of religious people have embraced through history. So he's saying, well, the reward at the end is going to be a final judgment where the good and the evil are separated and sent to different places. So all of this stuff is basically Zarathustra's invention. And you say, well, okay, I've never heard of Zarathustra, right? How did his ideas become what everybody I know believes? Well, we're going to get to that in just a few minutes. But first, I want to start with the origin of the God of the Bible. And I think we have to start with who were the people of the Bible. So, okay, so Eric, what was the most popular answer to that? Where did they come from?
All right, I can go ahead and share the results. And question number 2, where do you think the ancestral Jewish people came from? It was pretty close. No one said United States of America. Egypt was 25%. Chaldea was 31%, but the winner was Canaan at 44%.
Good call. So in fact, they were Canaanites. And how do we know that? Well, because much of their technology is essentially the same as Canaanite technology, but not the same as, let's say, Egyptian or Chaldean technology. And the real, clincher is that the earliest inscriptions we have of Hebrew are actually almost identical with Canaanite lettering and Canaanite words. So it's pretty much a slam dunk that the Jewish people were not descended from some visitor from Chaldea. They're the same mix of people as the Canaanites, and as far as we can actually tell, they may have been refugees from the Bronze Age collapse. That's debated. But one of the interesting things is of course, that they worship the Canaanite gods. So if you were to go through, let's say, a Jewish village in, let's say, 1100 or 1200 BCE, or Hebrew village in the Judean hills, then you would find, you'd find no pig bones, so they were already clearly keeping kosher, shellfish, but you'd find plenty of idols of El and of Baal and Ashtoreth. And any of you who've read the book of Judges, as I think many of you have, will recognize the theme that, that there's this constant cycle in the book of Judges, that they're, always, worshiping idols, and the good guy, the hero, comes in and says, no, you should be worshiping the God of Israel, and everybody ignores him, and then something happens and they all agree to repent, and then by the next chapter all that's forgotten, and they have been, they're going back to worshiping El and Baal and the idols. And you wonder, just a second, I mean, nobody's really that stupid, right? But it turns out that they weren't. They never got the message. Basically, as far as we can tell, there wasn't a particularly Hebrew, specifically distinctive religion in these earliest phases. They always, worshiped the same gods as the people they had come from. So, okay, so just a second. How did the Hebrew God come to be? Well, again, we don't really know, but the Hebrew God seems to have been a fairly minor, distinctive ethnic god of the Hebrews sometime around the 10th century. The only very indefinite indication we have from earlier references in Egyptian writings is for the name Yahweh is from a people called the Shasu, who is essentially what the Bible calls the Edomites, a group of people to the south of what's now Palestine. So, sometime in the 10th century, Yahweh became the distinctive ethnic god of the Hebrews, but it's not even henotheism. I mean, Yahweh is sort of our guy in the neighborhood, but not necessarily one of the big guys. And gradually, Israel became pretty prosperous. You'd never know that necessarily from the way that the book of Samuel is written, but it was actually quite prosperous from archaeological point of view. And El became sort of conflated with Yahweh. Oh, I meant to mention, so Yahweh sort of one of the other gods, and here's, for example, Yahweh and his wives, basically, in a piece of pottery from Israel. So gradually, as Israel became stronger, the lead god, El, became identified with Yahweh. So the national god, we discovered that all along he was the same as, the lead god in our pantheon. It was just under a double identity. But he was always, worshipped with all of the other gods. And it's only after the exile that you actually see hard evidence that they really were monotheists. They had, banished all of the other gods. There's basically no statues of Baal or the Ashtoreth or anybody else from, after the exile. So why was Israel rich? Again, we have some pretty canny politicians and worthless war leaders who unified, as is the story for just about every other place. But one of the things that we don't think about much today is that the two biggest and richest centers of civilization were Mesopotamia, just to the northeast of Israel, and Egypt, just to the west of Israel. So basically, and there's good reasons why you don't want to go through here. It's much drier and it's much wilder, so there's a lot of bandits. So essentially, all of the trade routes between the two leading powers of the Near East passed through the Kingdom of Israel, and so they were able to, make quite a good living off of the taxes. And they also turned out to be a great place to grow olive oil, olives for olive oil, and grapes for wine. Two of the most popular commodities that could be carried. So this was a great place to be in 900 BC, and Israel became very wealthy and very, very decadent. As far as we can tell, at this time, the time of David and Solomon, Judea wasn't much to look at, meaning that nobody yet has dug up very much from that period. Almost everything that's substantial that's been dug up from Israel is either from the Northern Kingdom's rich period or from substantially later than Solomon. And so we have almost no material objects. So Judea was, as far as we can tell, pretty much, a hideout, for a band of perhaps marauding warriors. We're not entirely sure who the real David was. So in fact, what a lot of people thought were the stables of Solomon turns out we can now be reliably dated to the reign of Omri, and they were built for Omri, one of the rich kings. Okay, so you probably think, just a second, I never heard about this. What's wrong with this? We're all wealthy, and the country's wealthy. What's to complain about? As a matter of fact, the all was not very well because sorry, I think this is not the slide that I had intended to slot in there, but it's the same topic. My apologies. But it was very unequal. So like most rich countries, not all, but like most rich countries, most of that wealth was going to a few people at the top, and a lot of ordinary people were getting done out of land. And those are the kinds of concerns that are reflected in the minor prophets that are writing in the, or who are speaking in the 8th century BC, who are getting recorded somewhat later. So there's an awful lot about economic justice, and they are speaking in the name of the national god, because of course the kings were what we would call globalists. They're very much interested in global trade, and so they make sure to be worshiping the right gods, the gods of the bigger kings to the east and to the west. So if you want to critique raise a religious critique against this kind of exploitation, then who better to invoke but the God of Israel, the national God, who's kind of a minor figure. Let's make him a major figure. Okay, but there's still not really something we would call Judaism at this point. There's a temple, certainly, and the key event seems to have been, the conquest of Judea by Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and he, took back all of the, elites of the city of Jerusalem, and it seems that in their spare time, which they had plenty of now because they were no longer actually running anything, they redacted, the early writings and gathered together some of the writings of these prophets of Yahweh who had talked about the injustice of the wealthy period. So they had, they essentially put together what is the core of the Hebrew Bible. And then they had a real stroke of good luck. And that was that the Persians conquered Babylon only, about 45 years later. So we're talking about a generation or 2.5 later. And their ideas were completely different from those of the Babylonians, who were more like most empires, like the Inca or the Akkadian empires or the Egyptians. They felt that if you didn't coerce people's religious beliefs, they'd be happier and better servants for the empire. It wasn't because they were enlightened; it was sort of enlightened self-interest. It wasn't that they were wonderful humanists. But it also helped that they had been influenced by Zoroastrianism, by the teachings of Zarathustra. The Persians basically said, look, everybody, to all the elites, everybody go home and take your religion to you, and you can practice your own religion just so long as you pay taxes and pay tribute to the great emperor. And so Judaism really got established, recognizably modern Judaism established in Palestine at that time, using the stories and writings from the previous 500 years. But the Judaism post-exile was very different than the Judaism pre-exile. So there's no idea of heaven or hell in, most of the Old Testament, but you do start finding ideas like a Messiah, for example, in the post-exilic books, whereas not in the pre-exilic books. So these ideas of a final judgment and heaven and hell, I should have put Messiah in there, all come into Judaism at that time. So this is kind of a remarkable story of a religious beginning, but it turns out that this was actually part of a much larger, cross Asia turmoil, from the Eastern Mediterranean to Eastern China. Many of the major religious thinkers were who founded the religions that we adhere to today, or don't adhere to, but that we know about today, seem to have come, in this period from about the, fifth or sixth century BC to maybe the 3rd or 4th century BC. This gets a name called the Axial Age, and it's like, long-standing debate among historians of religion. Is this a real phenomenon, or is this just, sort of lining up dates by chance? Is it, and if it's a real phenomenon, why did so much turmoil come, within a few hundred years, and so much revolution in religious thinking to, all across the Asian axis, from India to China to Judea to Greece, and that's a big question, but this is, I think, this is one instance of a wide range of religious turmoil. So let me stop there and take, let's say, 3 more questions, and then I'll come back for the final 15 minutes.
All right. Okay, yeah, we've got quite a few more questions here. You had mentioned the phrase Bronze Age collapse. What does that mean?
So most of the societies, most of the civilizations and empires that were dominant throughout the Middle East and the eastern end of the Mediterranean in 1300 BC were swept away and collapsed by the 10th century, the 11th century BC. Many of them under the attack by some mysterious group of people that are listed in Egyptian records as the Sea People.
Sea People, right? Yeah.
It's only actually the Egyptian Empire that survives, but greatly diminished in the 12th century. They just survived by the skin of their teeth, so to speak, and every other of the major empires, none of which we've heard of, because but they all vanish. All the Anatolian empires, they all just disintegrate in that 150 years period. And of course, that's why we think part of why so many Canaanites were fleeing to the hills, is it's not necessarily. I was just there a few weeks ago, and it's dry and rugged, and it's not a place you would settle if you really had a choice.
I was under the impression that the climate was a lot different out over there 5,000, 6,000, 10,000 years ago than it is now.
Oh, it certainly was. And it was even different, 3,000 BC, 1,000 BC, 3,000 years ago, in the time of the early prosperity, it was a lot more forested. It's been much overgrazed. But the rock is not very conducive to growing stuff.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Trent, you want to take a question?
Yeah. So there are a couple of very interesting ones here, though. I would like to ask this one: when did language develop? This is more
That's a very interesting question,
right? When did language develop, and to what extent was religion's origin dependent on language? I think implying, that you can't really have, or you can't convince others of a belief system without having some kind of methodology to be able to do so.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And most linguists are putting the origin of language well before 10,000 BC. And so, therefore, well before the origins of anything we could recognize as religion.
Sure.
But, trying to ask someone, when did language originate? Well,
yeah.
That can get you, attacked in the street in some college towns.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great answer, though. Great answer.
Okay.
Yep.
Any next one?
Yep. So this individual messaged and was saying that they had learned that the Jews were descended from Abraham, who in the Bible is said was from Ur of the Chaldeans. What do we have any evidence to the contrary, or is there modern day genetic work that has been done to kind of back up the Canaanite claim?
Yes, in fact, there was a paper just in Science magazine last year that excavated a lot of ancient skeletons from Jewish and Palestinian sites over the first millennium BC, and they came came unequivocally to the conclusion that the Jewish people were Canaanites from their genes, because their genes matched those from the Canaanite cities. We've known for a century that the early archaic Hebrew looks and sounds very much like Canaanite. So it's pretty hard to avoid, even from that evidence, it's pretty hard to avoid that conclusion. And their genes are not as much like the ancestral inhabitants, let's say, of Iraq or Mesopotamia. So I think that pretty much nails it. Let me see if I can probably find that study fairly quickly, but not in 5 seconds, more like 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
If that's something that's critical to know.
Right.
Great, thank you.
One more brief one, or shall we go on?
Let's see here. Yeah, a brief one. Do you think the taxes that the Jews were paying to the Babylonians, do you think that's kind of where the origin of tithing came from, or perhaps it was more of like a necessity to raise funds for the people who were the scholars that were doing the philosophical work?
I don't know where tithing came from. I could tell, I can repeat to you the biblical story, but who knows, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on then. And I'll share screen again and come to our final section. Okay. All right, so I want to sort of turn to what's happened in the last 2 millennia. And in order to talk about that, I want to give a little historical context. And often, when you're talking to Christians, or if you are a Christian yourself, then you don't necessarily think about how Christian, the Romans were bad pagans, right? Just know that whatever they did, they were bad, and they worshipped false gods. Well, in fact, a lot of the religions that were popular in the Roman Empire were imports. So we think of Roman religion as Jupiter and Venus and Mars. But in fact, those were not the trendy religions, in the 1st century AD. The trendy religions were all imports, mostly from the Eastern Mediterranean. Some we're not sure where they're from. But Cybele was the mother goddess of Syria, who became very popular in Rome. Dionysus, of course, from Greece, and earlier from further east. Mithras, really, we think, was from Iran, from Parthia. But Isis, of course, is from Egypt. And these were flourishing. These were the trendy religions. If you were an up-and-coming young bureaucrat, you wanted to be part of one of these religions. These were the places to see and be seen. And these were modern in a very interesting way, in that they sort of took a lot of stories from the authentic religion from which they had come, and of course the names of the gods, things like that, but they adapted them to the the social tensions, the debt, and it's not too dissimilar than today. A lot of people live in too much debt, and a lot of slaves who didn't have much of a future, and very brutal, very efficient kind of police state, and So these religions, gave a kind of universal appeal. So that if you convert to us, and they were all welcoming, they're all universal. You don't have to be a member of our ethnic group or speak our language. We'll welcome you. Does this sound familiar? And there's rituals and a community and bonding ceremonies, and you can have lots of fun, with our religion and have a community, and you don't have to be a particular ethnic group. But what's really important is that they all told of some hidden cosmic drama, some sort of truth behind the reality, the grim reality that was, we could all see, or that was most people's lives at that point, where each member of the cult could have a major role. Okay, so keep in mind, that for roughly 3 centuries before Constantine, there were dozens of these kinds of universal religions, which were giving people a sort of meaning in the midst of a really kind of brutal life. So Christianity, which became the dominant, for the Romans, it was just Christianity was just another peculiar religion from a small place in the Middle East. And they didn't wake up to how big it was becoming until really the 3rd century. So let's go back to the origins of Christianity. So how did Christianity come about? So at the time, in the 1st century, we've got 3 major religious groups that are all not on speaking terms with each other, pretty much. So the powerful class, the wealthy, priestly, aristocratic class, the people who actually ran the show and ran the temple, were the Sadducees. And the Pharisees were a kind of alternative, what we would call rabbinic movement. They sort of were taking religion to the people. So you might regard them as a kind of populist movement. They had what we might regard as a very modern point of view, that they cared about ethics, but didn't seem to care about ritual as much, or at least not about the temple ritual. They had their own rituals instead. But what was one of the really distinctive things was the Sadducees were what you might call traditionalists orthodox. So they believed in the Judaism of 500 BC, whereas the Pharisees had taken on a lot of these Persian ideas, like heaven and hell and final judgment and Messiah and the whole 9 yards. And then there's a group that, according to our Roman sources, was just as prominent as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but for some very strange reason is left out of the New Testament entirely and never mentioned by name. And I'll let you speculate a little on why that might be, but it's a monastic group. They're mostly living apart from the cities, in retreats in the desert, and they practice baptism. And you think, just a second, is there anybody in the New Testament who's a little bit like that? Well, I'll let you guess. Okay, so in the middle of the 1st century, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who have been at each other's throats for 100 years, are getting into fights. And then there's 2 distinct groups of Sadducees, each of which are, going to war with each other, think that they're the rightful rulers of the place. And one of the groups, and I'm forgetting which, I think one of the Sadducee groups invites in the Romans and says, does this not sound familiar in the Middle East? Come in and make me, king. So yeah, Pompey invades Judea. The Roman ruthless brutality wins out. And so it's now a Roman province, but of course, the Sadducees aren't getting everything they want. They have been restored to at least some power, but not as much as they'd hoped for. But this whole area has been, again, it's still a major trade route, and of course, there's now a lot of Greek culture because of Alexander's program of Hellenization, of spreading actively spreading Greek culture throughout the Near East. So this is an ethnic powder keg. We've got Jews and Greeks and Romans and a variety of other ethnic groups all mixed together, and they all don't like each other. And there's just repeated revolts and small wars. Okay, so into this powder keg, who comes in but our protagonist, and we'll skip most of his life history, but just say, if we look at his teachings in the context of these three groups that I mentioned just before, who is he like? So he's very critical of the temple cult and the Sadducees, and that's true of both the Essenes and the Pharisees. But he talks a lot about heaven and hell and final judgment, and he uses a lot of metaphors also that are really more Persian, Zoroastrian than traditional Jewish metaphors. He mixes them up. So he's taking for granted a kind of Pharisaic metaphysics, which is unlike the Essene metaphysics. So it seems that he's also urging people to adapt a sort of flexible, what's the right thing to do doesn't depend on the day of the week or the time of the day. It depends on the context. And that's exactly what the Pharisees are saying. So insofar as we can situate Jesus, he's actually very, very similar to what the Pharisees are teaching. So let's get to that question again, Eric. What's the last question, and what did people say?
Yeah, all right. So the last question was, why do the Gospels, or why do you think, wait, here we go. Why do the Gospels portray Jesus as always arguing with the Pharisees? 34%, which was pretty close to the winning number, said that because he disagreed with the fundamental principles of the Pharisees. 3% because the Pharisees were good. 16% because the Sadducees were all killed off before the books was written, and we kind of realized that isn't, or learned that isn't true. But the winner by far is because the Pharisees were hypocrites. Okay,
so I'm going to turn for number 3, because just think now, who's Jesus actually fighting, or in terms of his teaching, he's actually opposing and disagreeing with the Sadducees. And insofar as the gospel records have any validity, it's the Sadducees who arranged to have him executed. So insofar as we can tell, his fights with the Sadducees. But just a second, 70 AD, is yet the latest revolt, and this is a big one. And the Romans come in and they bulldoze the Jewish state off the earth, and they burn down and smash the temple. So all that's left is a little piece of, there's actually just there's almost nothing left of the original temple at all. But there's a little bit of Herod's temple left in the so-called Western Wall. So the Sadducees, the elites, are complete, they're killed, and the rest are scattered. So who takes over Judaism? It's the Pharisees. They're the only ones left. And they define what Judaism has become. And of course, the Christians are arguing with the Pharisees all the time because there's no more Sadducees. So they were Sadducee, if you can pardon that awful, awful pun from Sunday school.
Sadducee. I never heard that. I've heard other people talk about it, but I never heard that growing up.
All right. Okay, you were lucky. Okay, so, all right. So how do these ideas, spread? So again, the record of early Christians in Judea just goes flat after the invasion of Titus. We just have no evidence for them in Judea at all. The only Christian records we have from after 70 are from outside Judea. And so we have no idea, what any of the people who at actually, or we have only a modest idea about the people who actually lived with Jesus, thought or said. But the Christianity that became popular in the 2nd and 3rd century in the Roman Empire was mixed with a great many other things. So we basically have Paul's Christianity, and Paul never met Jesus, never spoke with him. So, and it seems to have had a lot of conflicts with the people who did. So it's very likely that Pauline Christianity is quite different from the Christianity of Peter and James, and the Jewish Christianity that was quite prominent, from around 50 to around 70 AD in Jerusalem. So, but we're finding evidence that many diverse groups took Jesus as a kind of figurehead. Many other, what we might call New Age thinkers adopted Jesus as one of their heroes. And a number of the so-called Gnostic groups, where they're, some secret knowledge they're trying to attain, sort of synthesize Greek philosophy with, these Jewish and Christian ideas, and a number of them were quite popular. So if you've ever wondered why the Gospel of John sounds so different from the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's not only a choice of language, it's also the constant reference to Platonic philosophy or Neoplatonic philosophy that was characteristic of these Gnostic groups. So anyway, there's these endless arguments. There were so many different Christian groups and so much politics. That's really more than we can get into here, until Constantine decides to sort of capitalize on the popularity of Christianity and comes to power, promising to make it legal, which he does, and to promote it, which he does. I think in the interests of time, I'm not going to say much about Islam, but that's maybe I won't say anything about Islam unless there's some questions. So Christianity is sort of becomes formalized. There's essentially only one big split in the 10th century between the Orthodox and the Catholic. But as the Catholic Church is becoming more powerful, there's more and more evident corruption, and a great many reformers calling attention to this corruption, and most of them get burned alive or get pulled apart by horses or some other pretty pretty prominent fate. But Martin Luther had the good luck to be trying to spread his ideas at the same time as just after the printing press had been invented. And after they've printed the Bible in Latin, what do you go on to do next? Well, people want small books, and Luther is a prolific writer, so is Calvin. So they spread these ideas, and that sort of it really speaks to the moment, because there's this tremendous social ferment because of the emergence of the bourgeois, the trading class, the merchant class, and the small manufacturers in Europe in the 16th century. So because of this, this rapid exchange of ideas, Luther actually starts a Reformation that then leads to the splitting of Christianity that we see today. So Christianity has changed, but in fact, new religions have been invented that adapt, some motifs from old religions, but are also peculiar to, or specifically well adapted to, their societies. And I think we don't perhaps give Mormonism enough credit. It's the really distinctive American homegrown religion that has taken off, and it has a lot of real American ingenuity. It's got a catchy story, a completely ridiculous story, but hey, I mean, this, that's very American too. So we have, this, but he's using this story to justify a real experiment in social living. When what you don't find out unless you really read early Mormon history, which is, let's say, a very unusual hobby. What most people don't know is that the Mormons were a kind of populist revolt against the hierarchies of Europe and particularly of the East Coast of the United States. That and basically the way of living was what we might call socialist, but a little more than socialist, almost communalist, where there's shared tools and a rotation. Anyway, the Mormons, the reason the Mormons kept getting turfed out of state after state was not just because they were weird, it was because they were successful. The Mormons out-farmed and out prospered just about anybody around there because of their ability to organize through their religion. Now they're very much a conservative movement, like fundamentalists in the South, but they were what we might be called a kind of socialist progressivist movement in the mid-19th century. There's lots more. I think I'm probably, in the interest of time, not going to go into those, but I think I want to reflect just a little bit on modern Christianities. So I've talked about how Christianity was synthesized from several different threads and has split and diverged in many different ways, adapting to the new situations. But I'd like you just to reflect, if you have talked with a campus evangelist, or perhaps you've been a campus evangelist, what are the kinds of things that you hear in the kind of evangelism to young people today? We hear about personal relationship with Jesus, or God having a wonderful plan for your life, or that if you believe in God, you'll be successful. The problem is that none of these phrases, or even anything remotely like them, can be found in the teachings of Jesus. So what's what's going on here? How has Christianity morphed so completely that except for the names and the stories, the teachings are very dissimilar. So I'm going to leave you with that question. Maybe we can talk more about it in the Q&A. But it's I'm going to wind up with just something we don't necessarily think about, but maybe we should think about a bit. And that is, to what extent, most of us are either recovered from religion, like myself, or maybe never practiced it, or maybe some of us are still on the fence. But many of us who are avowedly secular think that we're done with religion and that it doesn't influence us anymore. And I would claim that, in fact, that's not true, that, in fact, we are participating in religious modes of feeling a lot. And many of our core concepts, many of the things that we have used to sort of, that we talk a lot about as centers of value, not all things, but many things are, in some sense, reworked concepts from religion. And I'm just going to give you two. So the idea of passion, which is very popular in the last 20 years in America. Most cultures don't value passion. This is a very distinctively American ideal. And in many other cultures, in Latin, the word is fanaticus, which means inspired by the gods. Or in Greek, the word is enthusiasm, or the Greek roots are enthusiasm, which basically means being full of gods or being possessed by the gods. So this idea that you are somehow motivated beyond rationality is something that we take almost some praise for, but it's a fundamentally religious idea. And then I think one of the most commonplace and in some sense confusing ideas has to do with what's your true self. And that's again a very popular phrase among New Age folks, or consciousness or identity. They're all talking about some sort of basically deep essence, and yet there's not really very much evidence that any of these things exist or any more real than the soul. So this kind of way of talking, I think, has come over even into a lot of secular discourse. So I'm going to just wind up here and say that there's lots of different ways to be religious. As far as we can tell, remember last time, there's essentially no hardwiring for religion, but a lot of our distinctively human tendencies can be drawn together in religion. But religions have to adapt and do adapt to the changing mode of life, so that the kind of a religion that may be popular in America wouldn't necessarily work in many other times or places. And I'd like to end with, America likes to be number one. Well, I think we are the leading mutation factory for religious ideas in the world, where more new religions are synthesized here than I think any other any other country of comparable size or per capita. So for those of you who would like to follow up, I recommend dozens of books, but I'll recommend three in particular. The Evolution of God, which is more about the Abrahamic religions. Ara, Nor, and Zion's more big gods is more about the transition to Bronze Age religion, and a sort of comprehensive but very abstract sociological survey is Religion and Human Evolution by Robert Bellah. Beautiful book, not for everybody. All of these are, chewy reading. This is not something to take to the beach. And then for those of you who would like to go into a bit more, I think I'll be teaching a course again for the American Humanist Association in the fall on the evolution of religion, which will be, this has been the, one country per day version. I think we'll do the, one country per week version in the course. And there'll be a lot of, it's limited to 20 people, so there'll be lots of chance to participate. So with that, thank you for your attention, and let's go to a more extended discussion.
Dr. Mark, thank you so much for talking us through this. This was a really, really great discussion. And, I kind of feel like I am living in the middle of religions evolving. I'm seeing more and more churches being LGBTQ friendly, even though their doctrine clearly states that horrible things about the LGBT community. And in just this world religions tree that was kind of brought up in the chat shows this distinctive branching of religions over time, and as religions die and people get in arguments and fights. So it seems like it has always been evolving and never really stopped, but might have these surges in times.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Let's see here. We have a few more questions. Where do you feel like the idea and the teaching of the Holy Spirit comes from? It seems to be something really in the New Testament only. And
yes, it does. I have not really come across what I think is a convincing account of that. I think, so this is just my own opinion, that it has a lot to do with the mixing of the sort of Christian early teachings of Jesus with the Neoplatonic tradition. So Jesus is sort of taking a lot of Zoroastrian ideas, which include these sort of active, emanations from God, and he's passing those on to people, or people are hearing them from other places, and they also have these sort of Neoplatonic ideas of the realm of the abstract. So that's my hunch, where those two streams fuse in second century Christianity to sort of make a real essence out of the Holy Spirit. But this is just an educated guess, really.
it almost feels like it's a a solution to a problem. I'm not quite sure what the problem was, why we needed them, but it just kind of feels that way. I don't know. I'm probably just talking out of my anus.
I had a very brief discussion with someone earlier here about, I think that it does seem like it's like everything, like every evolutionary problem. It seems like you provide a solution. And the solution in this case was some kind of belief system that benefits you in a way that, well, that you couldn't otherwise derive something from. But yeah, so we've got a lot of different, I mean, philosophical, anthropological, and religious questions here. So I'll shoot you with another one.
Sure.
So there's one that is talking about the sort of prehistory again, and it's related to, given that many tribes, it says, have animistic beliefs, why do you not date the origins of religion to tens of thousands of years ago, right prior to that, basically?
Yeah. So when people talk about tribes, you're usually talking about subsistence agriculturals, because that's most of the so-called tribes that are written about and have been encountered. And there were very few really good, solid contacts between anthropologists and hunter-gatherers. And I think that what we see is that generally speaking, the religions that we, as you point out, animism as it's practiced in the subsistence agricultural societies seems like a very powerful, it's very obviously a religion. But as far as I can tell from the reports from hunter-gatherers, there's not really that kind of earnestness or urgency about the spirits or the ghosts or what have you, among hunter-gatherers. They just don't take them very seriously. Some believe, some don't. Some claim to have seen some of the trickster gods, and some say this is nonsense. It's okay. You can all get along. You don't fight over religious beliefs, over ghosts. But you're quite struck by the contrast and the level of anxiety. So, for example, in hunter-gatherer societies, there's spirits don't punish you. They have a general idea of misfortune, and sometimes that misfortune is personalized a little bit as a sort of a bad god, but it's sort of vague and random. So they really do have kind of a word for bad luck. But in many subsistence agricultural societies, there's no such thing as luck. If something bad happens to you, it's because somebody willed it, made it happen, and that somebody could be an unhappy ancestor who hasn't gotten their fill of sacrifice, could be some other malevolent spirit that you've offended for somehow, or it could be a witch in your village or the next village. And so you have to find out, if something bad happens, you have to find out who did it, who's to blame.
Right.
And that leads to, as we know, all kinds of problems.
Right. So it would be the distinction between a simple misfortune based on the fates of the odds of reality versus that you must believe that misfortune comes from an entity or an external.
You have to find out who's responsible.
And
so how you
find
can
out the culprit.
Who you can appease to make it better, who you can
that
propitiate.
go away.
That whole idea of appeasement of angry spirits or angry ancestors it's only found, as far as I know, among the subsistence agriculturalists, the people who are sort of making a living in soil. As far as I know, it's almost never found among hunter-gatherers.
Fascinating.
Much more pragmatic, down-to-earth people.
Fascinating.
All right, we got one final question. We talked a lot about the evolution, drawing upon the history and kind of what shows up today. But going forward, where do you see religion evolving? And do you see religion ever no longer being needed in society? Do you think it'll disappear and logic and reason reign?
What a great question. I love. So I suspect for the near term in the United States, we're going to have, a plethora of new invented religions trying to address the anxieties that people feel. I think, the kinds of crazy religions that we thought were bad enough, 50 years ago, I think they're going to be nothing compared to what people are going to come up with in the next 50 years. So I think there's a good reason for that. And let's compare the past 50 years in America and Europe. So since the end of the Second World War, the last 70 years, most of Europe has gone secular, and America has remained devoutly religious. And why is that? I think most, not all, but most sociologists say it's because, there's not the same level of anxiety, insecurity in much of Europe, or in many, middle-class Europe, as there is in the United States. You are one, rare disease away from complete bankruptcy.
Therefore, we need prayer. And who do we appease?
Yeah. So there's a lot of potentially, you're like, the subsistence farmers, in that, you might get a big payoff. You might get a bigger salary and you pay less of it in taxes. But, if something bad happens to you, you're real shit. Yeah. Whereas, in Europe, when I worked in Europe, I made half the salary, but a much better life, much less stress. I think it's just the way that people manage, anxiety and inequality. As far as I know, all of the really, secular societies have been pretty egalitarian. I shouldn't say that's entirely true, but most of them have been. And, a lot of the really hierarchical societies have been, more prone to what we would call mythology. So I guess the short answer is, I think over the next, foreseeable future, the next few decades, I don't see religions disappearing from American life. I expect that maybe QAnon will become a religion in 10 years. I mean, yes, right. What a horrible thought. I can see many of you throwing up your hand and saying, what a horrible thought. But why not? It's, got weird stories, and all you need is a few aliens, and QAnon could really take off in a flying saucer. But it's speaking to, the anxiety that, and the sense of disappointment that many people feel. That's my short answer to that. And thank you for hosting me. I probably won't stay on too much longer. I've got, a lot of stuff to do for tomorrow, some of which might actually get done in the next half hour, but probably won't.
Dr. Mark, once again, thank you so much for coming on again and talking with us. This was educational. I got way more out of it. In fact, there's a couple of times where the pieces clicked together. I had disparate bits of knowledge and you filled it in. So thank you so much for that. Really, really appreciate it.
Great.
Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. And Dr. Mark, if you've got to take off, totally okay. You might think, how can we possibly even come close to topping that? Well, we can't. This discussion was the pinnacle. This was the apex. This was just kidding. We have another one coming up next week, another RfRx. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be doing RfRx, exiting the rabbit hole from red pilling to recovery with Stephanie Kemmerer. Events, and here's the description. This is a lot about conspiracy theories. Events of the modern era have perplexed and confused many of us. No one is immune from ridiculous beliefs. No one. This is the true story of how Stephanie fell into the rabbit hole and how she escaped. Doubt is the way out. So I think that this is a fantastic follow-up to what we learned today, kind of how this conspiracy thinking may very well shift into religious belief. So same bat time, same bat place, same bat channel. Come on back next week. And we're a little behind, but we still have got well over 90 videos on our RfR YouTube channel. So please come check those out. YouTube.com/recovering from religion. It's not a random mix of letters and numbers. It's great to have Recovering from Religion. And then if you've got any questions, comments, inquiries, or even some death threats, oh my gosh, we've got an email address for you to send those to.
Yeah.
Honestly, I haven't gotten a single death threat, but let's see here. RfRx at recoveringfromreligion.org. And we've got our blog and our podcast that we talked about at the beginning of it. And I got some links of those in the channel, in the chat, and in the YouTube description as well. All right, Trent, take it away.
Yes, sir. Thank you again, by the way. It really was a wonderful talk. And, I wanted to join this one specifically because I'm so fascinated with all that you had to say. It's amazing talk. Thank you. Seriously, thank you for your time and your knowledge. This is such helpful information to where we're at now. But yes, please, okay, if you're interested in this stuff, if you want to see more of it, follow us. It helps us. If you care about our mission, follow us. We got a Facebook page, Recovering from Religion, and a support page where you can find, you're going to find all these links in the setup. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. We have a TikTok, believe it. We have a newsletter that's going to be posted in the chat too. So it provides news, the resources that we're offering everyone, recently published videos, blog posts, you name it. You can find it all. Please check it out and look up this wonderful organization. We do so many great things, and the people here, as you can tell, and the guests that we have are remarkable. So please check us out and hit up some of those resources. And now we got another poll. Do we have another poll?
We do, folks. I'm about to bring on our founder and president, Dr. Darrel Ray, to kind of wrap us up with some concluding thoughts. Dr. Darrel Ray, he's coming to us live all the way from Kansas City. Sir, how are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing darn good, and I'm going to tell you something. I'm a fucking expert in the area that Dr. Mark talked about, and he was right on target. I couldn't disagree with anything he said. Starting from the very beginning, one thing he didn't tell us was that Göbekli Tepe, 12 to 14,000 years ago, they were doing this shit in northern Iraq. It's mind-boggling. When I first heard about that, I thought it was some space aliens thing. Oh, somebody's screwing around with us, but it's not. It's true. I'm sorry. It's in Turkey, actually. Sorry about it. But go look up Göbekli Tepe and read all about it. The archaeology there is fascinating. The religious rituals that were probably in practice there somewhere between 10 and 14,000 years ago. And this predates our other archaeology by 7,000 years in some ways. So there's probably a lot of archaeology we still don't know about out there. And when Dr. Reimers started off with the Göbekli Tepe, I thought, fuck, this is going to be a really good episode. And it was not disappointing. I want to say a couple things. I wished he was here. I really wanted to say a few things and let him know how much I appreciated it. I'm gonna also disagree just a little bit with him on one question. Monotheism. Eric, I don't think we've got a monotheistic religion today. I don't think we've had one ever. Maybe the Egyptian sun king with Akhenaten was monotheistic. But if you look at Christianity, it's not monotheistic. And I'll just challenge all the listeners, everybody is feeling right now. Can you name the 4 gods of Christianity?
There's like the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, and then there's Michael the angel and
No,
Gabriel.
no. You're
No?
close, but no cigar. No cigar. There are four gods: Father, Son, Holy Ghost, and Satan. And Satan's the most powerful. I mean, if you just look at the way the whole thing is structured, Satan seems to always come out ahead, especially with evangelical Christians. And then if you look at Catholics, they have five gods, and Mary is the fifth god. That's not a monotheistic religion. If you look at Islam, is probably the closest to a monotheistic religion we have, but even Islam believes in Satan. So at least you have Allah and Satan, and they seem to be pretty equal in power. Nobody ever talks about how Satan's going to overthrow God, or they say he is, but there's no evidence of that in their mythology. Anyway, I just had to throw that out. And another thing, that if you have not read about Zarathustra and Zoroastrianism, I once had my best friend was eventually the dean of Garrett Theological Seminary in Chicago. I mean, this guy really knew his theology. And one day I talked to him about how much Zoroastrianism influenced Judaism and Christianity. And I had never seen him get so upset and so angry when I made that assertion. Well, when Dr. Reimers said the same thing tonight, I thought it reminded me of my interaction with my then best friend and how angry he got at me for saying that Zoroastrianism had a major impact on Judaism and Christianity. But the fact was, Judaism was in captivity for 60 to 80 years. They came back to Israel. When they came back, the governor of Israel for 200 years was Zoroastrian. So they were under Zoroastrianism for 60 to 80 years. They came back to Israel and they're under it for another 200 years. How the hell does that not leak in? How is it not influenced? If you think about Satan and God and all that bullshit, all of that comes from Zoroastrianism. So if you've never heard this before, go off and read it. It's fascinating stuff. Anyway, I could go on and on and on. Eric, you know, I'm not here to, I'm supposed to do a short 2-minuter, but I've already Okay, well, folks, if you liked what you heard here tonight, then I would suggest you volunteer for us, because we're doing all sorts of good stuff. I shouldn't say shit, but good stuff all the time. I mean, just today I looked at almost any given day, we are taking more calls and chats outside of North America as we are inside. Not every day, but many days we are. We are becoming a global resource for people dealing with religion and religious issues. So if you want to help people, we can teach you, we can train you how to do that. And if you can't volunteer for us, you can certainly repost our social media, read our blogs, go and watch these things and repost them on your own social media. And last, of course, but not least, donate. We always need funds to support what we're doing. We're in major kind of expansion mode over the next couple of years. So that's it, Eric. I could turn around and make a whole talk myself about what Dr. Reimers already said, just commenting on his stuff. He was really on target. I can't say that enough.